For our tutorial in week 5, we're going to be looking at the modernisation of Japan. This is sometimes referred to as the Meiji Restoration, after Emperor Meiji is the emperor who leads Japan in the modernisation of Japan. It's under his watch. If you want a cultural representation or a modern representation, if you've seen the movie The Last Samurai, that is reasonably good depiction of the modernisation of Japan, though obviously it very much focuses on the beauty of and innocence of traditional Japan as opposed to what modern Japan turned into. And you've got to remember, if you do watch or have seen The Last Samurai, it's an American film which is trying to criticise the modernisation of Japan because it's modern Japan that will bomb Pearl Harbor and whom they fight in World War II. So that's why that film takes the side of the samurais. But what we'll be doing in this tutorial quickly is looking at where Japan comes from. So Japan in the 16th to 18th century, the role of Commodore Perry and this gunboat diplomacy that he employs, and then how Japan ends its isolation from the Western world, the impact that has on the gospel and Christian movement and missionaries in there, and then the actual Meiji Restoration and all that entails. And then the legacy that continues on, particularly in the 1930s and leading into World War II. So Japan in the 16th century, people call it the Tokugawa Japan under Tokugawa Hiroshima, who is the shogun. Or the shogun was like the lead politician. So you got the emperor, but for most of Japan's history, the emperor is kind of in charge by name, but it's the shogun who really runs the country. So 1543 saw the first arrival of Europeans on Japan that we know of, and these were mostly Portuguese and Spanish explorers. There's some missionaries there and merchants, and they want to the merchants and explorers are looking for trading partners, looking for wealth, and obviously the Christian missionaries there to spread the gospel message. But Japan is very much controlled by a country of religiously controlled by Buddhism and Shintoism. And a key part of Shintoism is the worship of the emperor. And so it's not just a let's replace one religion with another, that's going to have a political impact. And so by the late 1500s, Tsutomu Hiroshima, he's the he releases, who's the shogun, he releases this edict, and it's essentially he's trying to expel all Christians and expel Christianity and foreign trade out of Japan. So parts would say so this is the part of the edict. Japan is the country of the gods and has been receiving false teachings from Christian countries. This cannot be tolerated any further. The missionaries approach people in provinces and districts to make them their followers and let them destroy shrines and temples. So notice the problem that they've got with Christian missionaries is they're not really going to the emperor or the important people. They seemingly are focusing on the people in the provinces, the kind of middle to lower class people. This is an unheard of outrage. So the fact that you're destroying temples and shrines is an outrage. And so he, being the Christian, must follow the laws of the country and abide by their intent. However, some vassals illegally commend part of their fiefs to the churches and allow a church to start up. What this edict shows and what the consequence of it is that for the next 200 odd years, up until the 19th century really, Japan remains isolated from most of the world, particularly the Western world. So it's an island that pretty much no one in the West would ever have gone to. They obviously had some dealings with other parts of Asia, particularly Korea and China, which are on their doorstep. But on the whole, Japan really remains isolated for about 200 years. That is until in 1852 and 53, some mysterious black ships appear off the coast of Japan at Edo Bay, and they're under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry. Now, Perry's got this pretense that they're rescuing American sailors shipwrecked near these Japanese islands. But what he does is he goes ashore and essentially demands that Japan open its ports up to American ships. So essentially demands that you start trading with the West and start to have diplomatic relationships with Western countries. So quite, you could call it arrogant or brave, depending on your perspective. Perry had been sanctioned by the US government and president to have this kind of gunboat diplomacy. So it eventually gets to the stage where Perry essentially threatens that you either open up trade or we're going to start opening fire on you. And so we're going to come back with more ships and more troops and that. And so the Shogun initially refuses to respond to Perry. Kind of all of a sudden these Westerners have shown up, and so he doesn't want to respond to it. But under mounting pressure, he appoints two commissioners to negotiate with Perry. But Perry maintains that this diplomatic and military pressure by coming ashore with 300 men and delivering an ultimatum from President Fillmore. Now, this is part of what was said. So this is from the president to the emperor of Japan, which is really, you're really giving it to the shogun because he's the guy who's going to be making decisions on this. So part of it says, Japan is also a rich and fertile country and produces many valuable articles. Your Imperial Majesty's subjects are skilled in many of the arts. I am desirous that our two countries should trade with each other for the benefit both of Japan and the United States. We know that the ancient laws of your Imperial Majesty's government do not allow of foreign trade except with the Chinese and the Dutch, but as the state of the world changes and new governments are formed, it seems to be wise from time to time to make new laws. So in other words, go against these ancient laws that you have and actually keep up with the times. That's really what he's saying. It'll be good for you and it'll be good for us. So typical diplomatic persuasion there from a Western country, particularly America, that you'll get something out of this, but we'll also get something and keep up with the times. What happens is in 1854 in February, Commodore Perry returns to Japan, to Edo Bay, and he's got even more ships with him. And so the shogun faces this pressure from the Americans and from his own country about what is he going to do. And so he grants these concessions to the Americans because he doesn't want them to attack at Edo. And so they sign, it's called the Treaty of Kanagawa. And so this treaty was had four main conditions. That it said that they were going to protect American sailors, so American sailors who come ashore, opening up several ports within Japan to trade with America, American representation to Japanese officials should the needs arise over disputes, so essentially diplomatic relationships are opening up, and that America would become a favored nation, so favored nation clause. So America would be favored with trade and with certain taxations, things like that. So this period from 1854 ends Japanese isolation. There's another treaty signed 5 years later on 29th of July 1859, the Treaty of Edo, which opens Japan commercially to American interests, so it opens it up even more to American influence. The problem with this is you've got this tension now starting to grow within Japan that starts to express itself. And the tension is between a government that is, in many ways, caught between a rock and a hard place about if we refuse to open up to the Americans, we can be invaded by this power. But at the same time, you've got many within our country who aren't used to having foreigners around, don't want Western foreign influence, don't really care about the kind of wealth it may bring to our country. And so you've got traditional Japan, those within Japan who don't want this foreign influence, and people in the government and the business world who see this as an opportunity for wealth and for potentially growing this Japanese empire. And so you've got this movement, a nationalist movement begins, and it's really anti-foreign. It's called the Sonijoi, or the Revere the Emperor and Expel the Barbarian movement. And you see there's a wood carving over here, and here you've got a sumo wrestler, so a traditional Japanese warrior in that sense, and he's expelling the foreigner, so expelling the Westerner out of his country. And so here you have this real, in pictorial form, what this movement was about. And there's a strong nationalist movement within Japan at this time. Andrew Gordon, in his very good book, A Modern History of Japan, says it would be misleading to conclude simply that these treaties trampled a pre-existing national pride. Rather, from the early 1800s through the 1860s, the very process of dealing with the pushy barbarians created modern Japanese nationalism. Among shogunal officials, in daimyo castles, and in the private academies where politically concerned samurai debated history and policy, a new conception took place of Japan as a single nation to be defended and governed as such. So in other words, ironically, the modernization of Japan in opening up to the world actually led people in Japan to figure out, well, what is Japan? What does it mean to be Japanese? And so you got this nationalist movement that as the country is opening up, all of a sudden they're getting key ideas for what it means to be Japanese and how we are different from other people around the world. And so this movement has for every movement, every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. This is the reaction to that it leads to this real strong nationalist movement, which is going to continue to grow through the Meiji Restoration. So even though it continues to open up Japan, it will actually lead in the opposite direction of this strong nationalist group sentiment, where eventually that will take hold, and eventually it will take hold in the 1930s. From a Christian perspective, 1854, the Japanese government abolished the practice of furni, or a method of detecting hidden Christians within their country. And so, in other words, Christianity is now allowed. And this is during the time period where Protestant missionaries start to come to Japan. American missionaries, John Riggins, Channing Williams, James Hepburn, Samuel Brown, they go to Japan. They bring the gospel, evangelize, they teach in English. They'll eventually translate the Bible into Japanese. During the Meiji Restoration, in the coming years, there'll be freedom of religion, and that's a key component to being a modern country. And the number of Christians in Japan does slowly grow, though as a whole, Japan has been quite resistant to Christianity. I know at my church we support a couple of missionaries in Japan, and still to this day they are. It is a struggle there, and part of it goes back to the for so many years you weren't allowed to have Christians there, and out of all the religions that got banned, they specifically targeted Christianity. Now, this movement eventually leads to this thing called the Meiji Restoration, named after Emperor Meiji. Emperor Meiji rules from 1867 to 1912. So a long rule, and it's under him that the greatest change in Japanese history occurs, and where Japan really modernizes. Now, it's one thing to say modernizing, but it's nothing. What does that actually mean? So, first, there are four areas that we look at. You need political change. So, you need um, politics, or the political system in particular, to reflect more modern values. So, up until the Meiji Restoration, Japan was essentially a medieval country. So, what we look at with, think about with medieval Europe, it was similar with Japan. So, the first thing they changed is they have a representative government in the form of a diet. It's just called a diet, which in reality didn't really have much power. Most of the power still was held by a small minority. But essentially, you've got this at least pretense of political representation of the people. And so cabinet members are appointed by the emperor. This is why it had little power. Cabinet members are only appointed by the emperor himself. So the emperor actually still had all the control. But you're giving off this impression that, no, other people have a say in this. This is the same situation that happens in Tsarist Russia in the early 20th century. So they have a Duma, but essentially the Tsar, or the Emperor, Nicholas II, he still has all the power. So it's the same thing in Japan. The emperor holds all the power, but you've still got this group that advises you and meant to represent the people. Another thing the emperor could do, he could dissolve the diet at any time, and just ignore their advice. So for all the political changes, in reality nothing changes, but by perception, it becomes a more modern political system. It's not just essentially an emperor, a shogun, or a key leader or group of leaders, and that's it. Another thing is industrialization. So Japan adopts Western technologies and processes, and you see this, it links in with education, but things like engineering and the sciences become really important. Japanese workers are sent overseas to be trained up and then bring back that knowledge into the industrial age. And so you've got a period where transport infrastructure really modernizes thanks to this industrial push. The education system becomes really important. So in 1872, there's an Education Act that's it's compulsory primary schooling for everyone, and there's more technical schools. So obviously this links in with the industrialization, and so they want to focus on more scientific and technical knowledge. That is a key way to modernize in this way. Then 1890, there's an imperial rescript on education, which declared that we also, despite all this modernization, we also need to hold on to our Japanese traditions and culture. So we need to go back to teaching kids to revere the emperor. So even though we talk about the Meiji Restoration and the modernization of Japan, it's not just a complete rejection of what has come before. It's essentially the Japanese version of modernization, or modernity, as we call it. And so the education system is trying to promote new technologies, but at the same time traditional values of revering the emperor and these new kind of nationalist ideas that have sprung up in the 1860s. The military starts to modernize, so the conscription is brought in, and so the samurai are disappointed. So this is where the movie The Last Samurai obviously focuses on the difference between the new military systems. There's a rebellion by the samurai, the Satsuma Rebellion, and so the samurai kind of resist this new militarization. The Last Samurai, the story behind it is actually meant to be a French soldier who kind of goes over to the samurai side and sees the beauty of their lifestyle. But naturally, being an American movie, it's an American guy who does it. Um, and so the reason for this kind of modernization of the military, the samurai had served their purpose for if you needed a standing army within Japan. But one key part of modernization in the 19th century was you needed to expand out of your country. So imperialism, European imperialism, the 19th century is the height of that, and Japan needs to start doing that. If it's going to be a modern country, it also needs to be an imperialist country. It needs to expand out, and so you can't do that with the samurai. Because the samurai technologically aren't advanced enough, but they have um, a political role, and it's a bit messy, kind of their role in the new modern Japan. So what happens is you just need a new army, a new standing modern army that's going to help you expand out, and that's at the cost of the traditional samurai. And so you get by the 1899, you get this cartoon. So it's titled "Japan Makes Her Debut Under Columbia's Auspices." So what is happening here? This is kind of an interesting cartoon about what has happened during this time period, during the Meiji Restoration, or what they're aiming at is a debut is kind of like when a woman or a girl comes of age and she's essentially presented to society. It's her debut. So what is happening here? Colombia is America. So this is America holding Japan's hand. So obviously that's Japan, and bringing her out in front of everyone to present her. So here you've got uh, Germany here, you've got France here, and you've got Great Britain. And so all of a sudden Japan is being presented to these great European powers as someone who is now ready to kind of play politics with the rest of the world. And the reason America is there is because American kind of like we brought them out. We've kind of not forced them, but we took them by the hand, hence why they're holding hands, and brought them out. Now, the reason why this is in 1899 is because Japan and Great Britain are going to be signing a treaty soon. And so essentially the US is presenting Japan to Great Britain to kind of bring them together. And so it's just an interesting cartoon about how Japan was being received by those European countries, and kind of the point of this modernization was so that they would be involved or be included with these countries. Like I said before, a key part of all modernization is the expansion of territory. And so one of the key battles, or one of the key wars that enables them to do that, is this Russo-Japanese War. All right, they do fight. It's called the Sino-Japanese War, where Japan do fight China, which is important. But this one, the Russo-Japanese War, is far more important for how they're going to be perceived by the rest of Europe in particular. And so the background to this is there's growing tension between Russia and Japan because Russia is starting to move itself into the north of Asia. And so Japan have imperialist ambitions in Korea and the northern part of China, but also Russia do as well. And so eventually that's going to lead to tension and the outbreak of war between the two of them. Because Japan had controlled the Korean Peninsula by the mid-1890s, so after the Sino-Japanese War. They're controlling parts of China and Korea. And so what happens is Japan declared war on Russia on February the 8th of 1904. And everyone in the world that hears about this war is just expecting the Russians to win and win very easily. And the main reason is because Russia is European and Japan is full of Asians. And obviously, Europeans would beat Asians. That's just the way the world goes. And that's literally what most people expected. Russia has also got an almost endless supply of resources and certainly soldiers, and so the really tiny Japan would have no chance against the might of the Russian Empire at this stage. A couple of problems for Russia in trying to get its soldiers over. They leave Russia. They're trying to go around. Um, they're trying to go through the Suez Canal and kind of get their navy through the Suez Canal. Kind of you don't have to go all the way around Africa. The problem is they accidentally fire on a British ship, and so the Britain's like, we're not letting you sit through the Suez Canal anymore. They stop in on the way around Africa, where at various times they pick up a tiger somewhere, and the tiger gets in and decides to make its home on the ship right near where the steering was, and so they couldn't steer one of the ships for a while because this tiger wouldn't move. And they all fire on each other, the Russian ships, and so by the time they actually get around to Japan, the navy kind of just barely makes it, and they get there and they just lose comprehensively. Battle of Port Arthur in January 1905, the Japanese win that, and then in March of that year, which is a land battle. And there's a decisive naval battle, and that eventually forces the Russians to ask for peace. And so the peace is the Treaty of Portsmouth, and they get the US involved in forming up this treaty. But it doesn't actually. The treaty doesn't grant Japan any territory or monetary reparations, and so Japan actually come out of this, and particularly the Japanese people come out of this really angry. They feel betrayed by the Americans because the Americans are involved in the peace treaty, and they kind of viewed it as European or Western countries looking after themselves. So even though the Russians had lost this war and had failed, the Americans come in. They want to help the Russians out, not to make the Russians look too bad. And so Japan becomes really angry and annoyed about this, and so that leads them into further expansion. So in 1910, they're going to go into Korea. So they annex Korea, or they it's a non-violent takeover of Korea. And what they're going to use war, they're going to use intimidation, they use politics, they're going to use everything they can to kind of destroy Korea. And they actually don't leave Korea until 1945 after they lose World War II. And so they're there to kind of wage an all-out war against Korean culture. So schools and universities forbid the speaking of Korean. They emphasize the loyalty to the Japanese emperor. Public places adopt Japanese names and language. Films are in Japanese. Becomes a crime to teach anything that's not essentially a government textbook. And so they burn over 200,000 Korean historical documents. 100,000 Japanese families are sent to Korea to kind of Japaneseize it. So the Romans would do this with Romanization during ancient Rome. So it's kind of like the modern Japanese version of it. And so you're trying to wipe out this Korean culture. This is what this is early on, but this is what Japanese imperialism looked like in the early 20th century. The historian Donald Clark said that the colonial government made Koreans worship the gods of Imperial Japan, including dead emperors and the spirits of war heroes who had helped them conquer Korea earlier in the century. So you're worshipping the people who probably killed part of your family, or and certainly tried to destroy who you were. Um, for the Japanese, control of Korea is critical for their ambitions in taking China. Um, for Japan, China is the key to controlling the whole of the Asian region. So annexing Korea, even though it's in 1910, is going to be a crucial step for their further steps that they make in the 30s and then even into the 40s with during World War II. And so this is the start of that, though a lot of Westerners didn't see it that way. This is the start of that process of get Korea. We can then go into China. And so they fully go into China in 1937. And Eric Liddell is one of the people that they will sent to a concentration camp. And then they'll expand down Southeast Asia. And, that's where they eventually end up in the islands of both Australia and Bobbin, Australia. The legacy of the modernisation of Japan, I think it's the more immediate legacy is the militarisation and the rise of militarism and military dictatorships in the 1930s. So, because all the way back in the 1960s, you got the development of these new nationalists. What is Japan? What does it mean to be Japanese as opposed to being a Westerner? What do we stand for? And one of the things that they talk about is the loyalty to the emperor and this idea that we need to create, because we've got an emperor, we need to create an empire. And so you've got these right-wing nationalist groups that by the time you get to the 1930s have infiltrated particularly the army. The army is really nationalist in Japan. And so the army see it as their job to expand the Japanese empire. And so one of the places that they do expand is Manchuria. So in 1931, they'll expand, they attack Manchuria. And the most important thing that happens out of this attack in Manchuria is that the government, the prime minister, and the government officials at the time had no idea, one, that it was going to happen, and also they couldn't actually, even though they told the army to stop, the army just refused. And so by 1931, the army within Japan is essentially doing its own thing. And eventually the army, sometimes through assassinations and through other means, will actually take control of Japan. So by the 1930s, Japan becomes a military dictatorship. And so because it had lost control of its own army, because it's become a real right-wing nationalist group. Andrew Gordon again, the takeover of Manchuria marked a watershed in the history of Japanese foreign and domestic policy by far. But far from stabilizing the borders of the empire, it initiated a new era of expansion. And so Manchuria would lead to invading the rest of China, which then head into Southeast Asia. You head towards, the Philippines, which is controlled by the US. And this is where the US start to bite back on this, and that's where you lead into them bombing Pearl Harbor and all these kinds of events. Obviously, there's a lot of stuff that happens in between. It's not just a straight line between invading Korea and Manchuria and then straight into World War, but the attitude behind it is this idea of expansion. So even though modernization and the Meiji Restoration of Japan saw many great things and took it out of kind of medieval times, like I said, for every action there is a reaction, and the reaction was this rise in nationalism within Japan, which would have long-term consequences for the war. A good book on this, if you want to look at it, is that Andrew Gordon book, A Modern History of Japan. If you've got any questions, feel free to email me. But just a quick one for today's tutorial.